Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, as I was testing an old first generation AMD APU, I couldn't help but notice just how terrible it is in 2020. Okay, that's not quite fair. We've given the AMD A6 3650 a proper test and benchmark session before, but when I tried putting together a PC for about £20, it was clear then that the integrated HD 6530D graphics were the limiting factor. The lack of modern driver support with Windows 10 also hinders this chip if you are relying on the CPU alone and have no intentions of pairing it with a dedicated graphics card. These aforementioned drivers can still be obtained through Windows Update, though even with them installed, the only game from my current collection that seems to run trouble-free, aside of course from the ever-popular GTA 5, is The Witcher 3. I say that it runs trouble-free, but what I should have said is that it starts trouble-free. The Witcher 3 is one of those games that despite its age can still give modern hardware a good run for its money, though thanks to the fairly wide range of graphical options, can be made to run on even lower end hardware, if you don't mind graphical sacrifices. If you opt for low settings on fairly powerful hardware like I've done here, then you can expect at times over 300 frames per second, though this is of course pointless, as we are able to utilise far higher presets. The reason I've chosen these settings though for the time being with this hardware is to demonstrate just how much of a difference you can expect when using performance mods. Performance mods aren't a new concept by any means, but I couldn't help but wonder if we could fix the performance of the 3650 and HD 6530D graphics when using a couple of tweaks in 2020. This game has received numerous patches and updates over the last half decade, but it still attracts plenty of new players, a lot of whom I'm sure will be trying to play it on very modest hardware. Maybe not quite as modest as the A6 APU, but yeah, let's get into it. Firstly, let's talk about the performance with the AMD APU itself. If you want to play The Witcher 3 with the vanilla settings using this chip and no discrete graphics card, then you can expect a pretty low frame rate at any settings with any resolution. Even at 1024 by 768, your experience will probably look and feel a little something like this. This was actually 720, but yeah, the frame rate doesn't really change. I didn't have MSI Afterburner open, so I don't have the exact frame times and figures to give you, but I think it's clear that we aren't exactly having a decent time here. So let's try some tweaks. The first thing I wanted to check was still working was the Ultimate Graphic Options mod Renew by Marvel Master. This adds a whole host of extra options into the in-game menu so that you can adjust, well, a little bit of everything without having to play around inside the user config files trying to find each specific line. Here you can just mess around with the sliders as you please. With that being said, it's very easy to go overboard and turn everything down to the lowest settings possible, which unfortunately is actually the best bet for our AMD A6 3650. So prepare your eyes. I should say now that for this part I did switch back to the i5 and RTX system while I was installing the mods and tweaking the settings, simply because the A6 system started to hang a bit during web browsing. That does seem to happen for some reason under Windows 10, because under Windows 7 things ran a lot smoother. As I said before though, this does give us an interesting look at how low-end tweaks can impact performance on a fast PC. Even here with the i5 and 3070 system, in some places we were seeing double the frame rate compared to before, but my goodness, what a graphical sacrifice this really is. Other areas of the game didn't really differ that much, and I should also mention that this broke The Witcher 3. The only way I could fix this mess after I was done with the video was to reinstall the game and then start afresh. Now that could just be me not paying enough attention to the correct uninstall instructions. In fact, I'm going to say it was most likely me not paying enough attention to the uninstall instructions, because after installing this mod and uninstalling it a couple of times after wrapping up the edit, it seems that the game was actually fine after I uninstalled it and then chose another graphical preset. Always read mod instructions. So it's clear that this tweak certainly makes some difference, but at what graphical cost? I mean, The Witcher 3 doesn't even look like The Witcher 3, but as I said before, this is necessary in order to try and turn our 10 FPS with the A6 3650 into 30 FPS plus. Can we do it? Well, in addition to the mod, I also made a quick edit to the user settings file under my documents, but I only changed the resolution to 640 by 480. This is lower than the game's lowest selectable option under the graphical menu, which is 1024 by 768. And in order to utilise our newly created 640 by 480 res, we have to run the game in windowed borderless. At first, I also set my monitor's desktop res to 800 by 600, just in case the game tried to default to anything higher, but it turns out that this wasn't necessary, so you might see a couple of changes in game quality and aspect ratio as we proceed. I also tried to maintain 1920 by 1080 with the super low graphical tweaks before switching to our custom resolution with the A6 APU, and unfortunately but expectedly, the game still ran pretty badly. Running around, causing carnage in wide open vistas certainly gave us higher frame rates than say walking around the busy city of Novigrad, but things in both instances were pretty unplayable. Speaking of unplayable, and switching then to our new 640 by 480 resolution, actually meant that we did see 30 frames per second sometimes, but this could still be deemed unplayable from a totally different perspective. I mean, look at the state of the visuals. So, we've got higher frame rates, but I'm not sure I'd be able to play the game or get very far in the story with these settings. The cartoony vibe is nice as a gimmick, but the pop-in is pretty hard to deal with, and trying to see anything is almost impossible. These factors in combination are pretty detrimental to the overall Witcher 3 experience. So just to put into perspective how small 640 by 480 actually is when not sort of zoomed in to the display, here is the game running on my 1920 by 1080 monitor. Graphically, things look quite sharp, but unless you're sitting an inch or two away from the monitor itself, then it's going to be quite difficult to read quest objectives and other text. In a story-driven RPG, reading text is pretty important, so continuing with the stretched image is probably a better bet, even if we do lose a lot of clarity. Even as we explored Novigrad, the frame rate did hit and exceed 30 FPS occasionally, but I still saw a couple of frame drops to single digits, which mainly occurred during fighting, or whenever I walked into a larger group of people. I say large, but I mean any number of people that equaled more than 3. So this APU certainly does not enjoy running The Witcher 3, but 30 FPS is doable with some heavy sacrifices. And I mean some really heavy sacrifices. Sacrifices that are still configurable in 2020. Now that might be good news to low-end users, or this visual showcase might send you running for Oblivion instead, if you're looking to get your fill of open world questing and swordplay. But there we go. I wanted to get this game running on what is probably one of the weaker CPU and GPU combinations that I currently own. The 6530D graphics are pretty poor by today's standard. They were okay when the APU released years ago, but yeah, they really do suffer these days. Nonetheless, I wanted to get the game running, and it turns out that we had to turn the game into pretty much mud in order to make that happen. But it will happen, though I'm not sure this is the best way to experience The Witcher 3, especially if you're a new player. Yeah, it's you're going to wonder what all the fuss is about if you jump into the game and it looks a bit like this. That being said, if you did want to play on the APU itself, the 3650, then you could still pair it with a second-hand cheap graphics card in order to get a much better experience. Let's say you wanted to play at a lower resolution, then you could probably still pair it with a second-hand 750 or something like that, and you would see much better frame rates and visual quality than you would here. But yeah, that's it. We've totally made a mockery of The Witcher 3's visuals, but I hope you've enjoyed this video nonetheless. This video was all about trying to hit that magical 30 FPS after all, so I'm glad to see we sort of did that in some places. But yeah, there we go. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.